Community Development Administrator here. I'm really excited about this project, particularly because I've studied environmental design and climate change resilience. So I'm excited to see how we can implement that here. And I'm really excited about how many people showed up tonight. I thought that the weather was going to keep people away. If you didn't sign in when you walked in, we have a sign-in sheet so we can make sure that we have people here and follow up with you afterwards. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Evan. We are recording this session just so that you know, so that we can share and post afterwards. There's nobody listening right now, but we are recording the session.
All right, thanks for coming. And what a great crowd. I mean, so happy you guys are here from the Butterfly Club. I'll get into this later. We worked with Elizabeth Crone and James Michelini to identify specifically for butterflies, which species appear to be declining precipitously in Western Mass, and then reduce that to just Franklin and Hampshire counties for this project. And we also worked with experts in other taxa like bees and moths. So we have a really great list of target species and the plants that support them. So some of you were here last time, most of you were not. So I'll just kind of give an overview about the project, the grant, that kind of thing, just sort of general housekeeping. And then we'll go into where we're at with this planning process. So essentially, this project, well, it's called The Future Looks Like Whately. And the idea is, how can we use native plants to create habitat for pollinators that might be at risk of local extinction, and also address the major climate change impacts occurring in Whately? So the project is funded by the MVP program, which is part of the Commonwealth's Energy and Environmental Administration. So it's basically a state grant that we received. My company applied together with the town, and our concept is to prepare for climate change through this process of nature-based solutions. And nature-based solutions are essentially improving ecosystems, making them stronger, more diverse, or creating new habitat and ecosystems on developed landscapes like homes and front lawns to better deal with climate change. That's essentially the briefest definition. So this is called an MVP action grant. This is like the second sort of MVP project that the town has done. Back in 2021, the town published this report, which you can find on the website. You can just Google it and download it. It was done with the FERCog. This is the initial step. It's identifying Whately's major climate threats. So that was completed. And then based on these top hazards that were identified, we were able to structure this as a follow-up, taking action on those issues. And that's why it's called an MVP action grant. So like I said, nature-based solutions, they're basically landscape practices that either protect, restore, and better manage ecosystems, or even create new ecosystems on a landscape in order to address climate change. It's also known as green infrastructure. So I'll be giving you guys a lot of different examples of nature-based solutions, and I'll show you the different properties in the town that we've identified as potential sites for this project, and which nature-based solutions may or may not, in my opinion, would work for those sites. But you don't have to take my word for it. We're also going to have a design exercise where you'll work in teams, and you'll be able to create your own very, very simple design for the library site, just as a practice using nature-based solutions. Don't feel intimidated. You don't have to pick specific species of plants. You just have to sort of work out the general layout or the general concepts that you would like to see. And then we have a survey that you can complete where you actually get to vote on the sites that you want. Because this project, for this project, we will pick 3 sites, and they all have to be town-owned. Within that, we will create designs for them. That's basically our major scope of work. So my company will create landscape designs for 3 properties owned by the town using nature-based solutions. And then we will give it all to you guys in a final PDF, which will be on the town website, yada, yada, yada. It will have complete plant lists. It will list the target pollinator species. You'll be able to learn about which plants support which pollinators. and how those plants can be used in these designs. And then you can take it home and, do whatever you want with it. So what are the major climate impacts in Whately, and how can we best be prepared for them? So according to Resilient Mass, which is a great resource that the state has put out, the major climate change drivers in Whately and in Franklin County as a whole are basically higher temperatures, which includes higher winter temperatures with less snowfall, and also oftentimes higher summer temperatures when we get these, over 100-degree days. An increase in precipitation, and also specifically in heavy precipitation events. If you can remember 2 summers ago, we had a lot of flooding, a lot of roads got washed out, some people lost their gravel driveways. That was an example of a heavy precipitation event where it was just like inches of rainfall in a short period of time. So that's another climate change impact that we're seeing, interspersed with extremely dry periods. And the problem with that is that if you go into a drought, over time, the soils become more hardened. They're not able to really absorb the water. And then if you get a sudden rain event, the water will just run right off the surface of the soil. It won't really take the water in because it's been in drought for so long. So that's very dangerous, not just for human health and security, but also, for our farmlands, it's, soil loss, nutrient loss. And we're also seeing stronger storms with higher winds. And this is actually a photograph in Whately that was taken in 2008, where there was what they called a microburst, and trees suddenly fell. In this case, it fell in the house. Statewide, as well as locally, some of the climate impacts that we can see, which are affecting not only the landscape, but also people, are health and cognitive effects resulting from the extreme heat. So, whether you're talking about people that are elderly or people that have compromised health or immune systems, having these higher heat days or these longer periods of drought could actually be deadly. Damage to buildings from heavy rainfall and overwhelmed drainage systems. If you get a lot of flooding, that can affect infrastructure as well as human lives. Freshwater ecosystem degradation. It's just basically, it's pretty clear with the runoff coming from the heavy rain events. And sometimes the rivers are meandering, they're changing, like the Mill River. It causes trees and other vegetation to fall into the river, or the river to change course, which then pollutes the water from the soil and the nutrients that are in the soil, and then that can affect aquatic life, including fish and other animals. Forest health degradation. We have a lot of invasive species, not just invasive plants, but also invasive insects, which are killing plants. So we're losing a lot of our hemlock trees, our ash trees, and in some cases other trees because of climate change affecting forest health. And then we have shifting distributions of native and invasive species. So with the warmer winters and the warmer in general temperatures, some of the southern species are migrating north, and we're getting more invasive species as a result. So what are our goals for the project? We want to address these top hazards: flooding, drought, severe winds and microbursts, and invasive species. That's the top 4 that the town identified. We also want to provide education to the community about this and the use of nature-based solutions to address this, which is what tonight is a part of. We want to capitalize upon the strengths that Whately has. And those strengths, I think, are reflected in this room. We have farmers, we have members of the library, we have, active gardeners, we have people that are involved with the Board of Health and the Conservation Commission. We can all, collaborate together. And, the Butterfly Club is a huge resource, not just for Whately, but for the state as a whole. Maybe we could get someone from Nasami Farm to come next time. We should all be thinking about how we can connect people to this project and work together. To improve crop pollination. Many of the crops grown in Whately specifically depend upon bees. Norse Farms is one of the biggest berry producers in the country. Those plants all need bumblebees. Yes.
Inside buildings are going to have open air plants.
Yeah, well, that's another story. I mean, they still need bees. They might just have the bees in the greenhouses, but raspberries and blackberries are bee pollinated, especially native bees. We want to, and there's other crops as well, tomatoes and so on, we plant. To restore habitat and support a wide diversity of plant, pollinator, and other animal species in the environment. This is language that came from Whately's MVP plan. I didn't just make this up. So our project timeline, we started in November. That was our first public meeting. where we sort of kicked off the planning process with some maps of the town and looking at potential sites and potential corridors. Tonight is the second point. We're doing our second public meeting where we're going to get a little bit more detailed and get your feedback on the proposed sites. So you're going to actually get to vote on which ones you want. And this is going to be a paper survey, or you can do it with your phone with a QR code. And you can, people can do it who are not at the meeting tonight. We're going to keep the survey open for another 2.5 weeks. Then we will gather the feedback from the survey, put it all together, and pick our final sites. Those will be announced probably in March. Then in June, keep on the lookout for a Pollinator Week activity at the library. We're going to try specifically to make something that's friendly for kids and families, maybe doing a craft activity, because unfortunately these nighttime meetings don't attract a lot of children. And just kind of getting the word out about the project, because we are going to be doing these design sites. And then in October, we're going to have public tours of the design site. So at that point, we will have draft designs ready, and we can all go to the sites together, walk the sites, and look at the designs together and talk about them. Then in November, we'll present those draft designs at a public meeting, get our final public input on the project. Then we will, synthesize that information, and then the project will launch the next spring with that final PDF and all the associated educational materials. In the meantime, there is stuff on the town website that you can see, like the last PowerPoint, and we'll be publishing the materials from tonight. So what are our updates since the last meeting? Sure.
So that ends at the design, and then as far as implementing the design.
So the way that the MVP program is structured is they have these action grants, and they have like what they call like an implementation or construction grant. So the next logical step will be you, meaning the town, will go back and apply for funding for implementation. And, we will be available if you want us to be involved either in managing that or helping you guys to figure out, who's a good candidate for the work. But basically you'd be hiring a landscaping or, engineering or company to install these designs, or you could apply for the funding to do them yourselves, and you could do it with volunteers and just ask for money to pay for the plants and maybe renting some equipment. So you can kind of approach it different ways. And that will be part of the process that we are in. When we're doing the designs, we will get your input about how you want to do the final implementation. The designs will reflect those goals. So one big update since the last meeting is we have a list of target species. What this means is native bees, butterflies, and moths that historically have been present in Whately and the surrounding area, but in the last 20 or 25 years, their populations have gone down due to a number of factors, including climate change, loss of habitat, pesticides, so on. And so their numbers are either very low or they're non-existent, but they have been observed here in the past as recently as 1999. And so I'm going to share those lists with you today. So we have identified 48 native bee species that are at risk of local extinction in the Whately area, meaning that they're not extirpated, they're not gone, but they could be gone within a short period of time. A lot of these bees are pollen specialists, and quite a number of them are long and medium-tongued bumblebees, which tend to be the species that are more at risk because they have more specialized plant needs. Like they're not full-on generalists. 34 butterfly species, including a number of skippers and a couple of different elephants, and surprisingly 44 moth species, including macro moths and micro moths. So it's really hard to get this data. This was a pretty complex process where we worked with a team of scientists to do this, and it took a few months. All these species are at risk of local extinction, not just in Whately, but in Franklin and Hampshire counties.
More about how that data was
Yes.
was it just we were looking to publish literature, or
Well, let's do that right now.
Okay.
So just give me a second, we'll go right into it. So to support these species, we're going to have a plant list for the project, and we will try to use as many of these plants in the designs. It's over 150 species of native plants to support these pollinators, and that will all be, part of this final process. I mean, this is just we're just going into this now, but I'm happy to we can look at these in more detail if you want. So I'm going to get to your question. I just wanted to, just to follow this trajectory, I'm going to highlight a few of these species so we can learn about them. So this is one of our at-risk bees. It's the eastern willow miner bee, Andrena bisilicious. It only gathers pollen from native willow. So essentially, bees need pollen to feed their eggs. Their eggs are laid in the spring, and they give them pollen so that when they hatch and they become larvae, they eat the pollen until they grow up and they fly out and they're an adult. Without pollen, bees can't reproduce. So essentially, the nest does not make it, does not survive. So pollen is life for bees. Nectar is what bees use to get from place to place. It's like their energy. So the nectar is sugar, the pollen is protein, and you need both. Typically, a pollen specialist bee will gather pollen and nectar from the same plant, but in some cases, they will only have certain plants that they gather pollen from, and then they might gather nectar from a wide range of plants. So they might be generalists for nectar, but the pollen is where it's at. If you don't give bees the right plants for pollen, you won't have those bees in your garden or in your landscape. The Banks' cellophane bee is another example of a, actually, I would say it's definitely a specialist because they only gather pollen from holly or ilex, of which we have many different species, including winterberry. And specifically in New England, they prefer winterberry. If you go further south, they might visit other ilex species. The common loosestrife oil bee, Macropus nuda, they're really interesting because they actually gather floral oils from the flower and pollen, and they need both to lay their eggs. So they're a specialist on native loosestrife, which is not the invasive purple loosestrife. It's a yellow loosestrife, and that's sort of like a marginal wetland plant. There's also some species of loosestrife that are very well suited for shade gardens. Some of them are fully shade tolerant. Celestrina neglecta is the summer azure butterfly. According to the data that we have been able to work with, they are declining precipitously in Western Massachusetts. And their host plants include New Jersey tea, dogwoods, and spirea or meadowsweet. The juniper hairstreak is a pretty well-known butterfly because it's been at risk for a pretty long period of time. They only lay their eggs on eastern red cedar. So that's definitely a host plant specialist. And the cobweb skipper, like many skipper butterflies, they prefer the native warm season grasses like little bluestem and big bluestem to lay their eggs. So these are examples of plants in the landscape that will support these species. As far as moths go, the fragile white carpet uses red osier dogwood, pagoda dogwood, and paper birch specifically. It is possible in other locations they might use other host plants, but that's the data for Massachusetts. The columbine borer moth, columbine specialist. So feel good if you have columbine in your garden because you're supporting an at-risk moth. And the pink sallow moth, it basically lays its eggs on blueberries and cranberries, which are Vaccinium genus, huckleberries, which are closely related, in terms of morphology, and for some reason, oaks and black cherries specifically. Their moths are weird. So this is how we got this list of species. We for the bees, we worked with Michael Veit, who is widely considered to be the most knowledgeable about native bees in Massachusetts. He's an independent entomologist based in Pepperell, but he works throughout the state and throughout the region. And he's oftentimes the person that is going into the museum collections and correcting the identifications of bees, even going back 200 or 300 years. That's how knowledgeable he is. And he was the primary author on the first checklist of bees of Massachusetts, which was published about 3 years ago. We also worked with Molly Jacobson, who is sort of a constant member of my team. I've worked with her on projects across the Northeast. And so between Molly, Michael, and myself, we were able to identify this list of at-risk bees based on historical and contemporary observations. For the butterflies, we worked with James Michelini and Elizabeth Crone. They published this pretty important paper in 2020, which looked at climate change impacts to butterfly populations using Massachusetts Butterfly Club data for over 27 years. And so they were really excited to hear about this project, and they lent their time helping us to specifically hone in on butterflies to target for Whately and for Western Massachusetts. And for moths, we worked with Stephen Whitebread, who is the founder of the Mass Moths website. If you haven't been to it, it's really cool. I believe it's massmoths.org, or I think it's .org. It's either .org or .com. But basically, you can go onto this website and you can search hundreds and hundreds of species of moths and see where they've been observed in the state and when, going all the way back to the 1800s. And so between him and Adam Cole, who's a very knowledgeable entomologist based in Wendell, we were able to basically take the whole statewide data on moths, going all the way back to the beginning of recorded observations, and then hone in on the species that seem to be declining precipitously and are still in the Whately area. So at our last meeting, does that answer your? So at our last meeting, we did a mapping exercise, and this is an example of one of the maps. We printed out a map of the town, and we marked, at the time we had about 13 properties identified as potential sites. Since then, we've removed two or three, because we found out that they either weren't town-owned or they were inaccessible to the public. Like you had to go through private land to get to them. So you can ignore like something like, Holy Ghost Cemetery that's owned by the church. The chapel is privately owned, so on. So those will not be on the maps for tonight. This was part of the community process. But basically, let's look at some of the takeaways from this mapping exercise. The Tri-Town Beach was identified as a potential site. Unfortunately, we then found out it wasn't owned by the town. It's owned by the 3 towns that use it. Around the town offices where we're standing today, that has shown up in many conversations to be a highly rated potential site. Hurley Field is another site that a lot of people have talked about. There's a campground that's connected to Hurley Field, but to get to it, it appears that you have to go through private land or access it from the river. And the riverfront is owned by the state. And the property that was adjacent was sold or given to the state. So that's sort of contentious. We're not sure if we can do the campground, but Hurley is a potential site. Another idea was looking at Chestnut Plain Road in general, because a lot of smaller properties have already been planted. So that would include, the library being like in the middle of that zone of town, the center of town. Sure.
Still own the green technically, the 2 wide swaths of grass in front of
The
those
commons,
houses?
like the common.
Yeah.
Who would be the best person would be Pete. He's not here tonight. He's the town administrator.
Oh, 2 big stretches of grass now.
I think the town probably does.
I live, yeah, right there, and I don't own that part. I had to take care of it. Right.
It's like the other side of the old.
So that's another site where, tonight we could, it's not on the survey, but maybe there's a way that people could write it in, like, because you have the printouts for the survey, you could write it in and we could go back and have a meeting about and find out if it is and verify it. And if it is, then we'll take that as a vote. As long as it's town owned, it's up for grabs, as part of this project.
But I can't imagine over that, the people who live there being indicated.
We would have to go through a process
Yeah.
with the
Yeah.
butters.
Sure.
Yeah,
Recorded, but-
We have so far we have been focusing on sites that are owned by the town that are not involving a butter specifically, but I don't want to say no to this idea because I think it has a lot of potential. So let's just say maybe that could be an add-on. So again, here you can see that this group identified that this cemetery, Holy Ghost, was not town-owned. So that was part of our process. This group also identified that adjacent property to Hurley, where this is the campground, is state-owned. And then just mentioning that sorry about that. Mentioning that the library, this says that the library is a good site. And then that this is not town-owned chapel. And over here, we have this group chose to really identify potential corridors rather than specific sites. So one corridor they identified was sort of a triangle going between the Whately town offices and Hurley Park and somewhere down here. They identified a potential corridor going north to south, east to west on these two major roads. And potentially a West Whately corridor going, you know, right through the West Whately Triangle and the West Whately Cemetery. So another thing that we talked about the last meeting was the floodplain maps. And so we actually have the data now. There has been an update. So in 1979, this is what the flood maps were for Whately. All the areas in turquoise are either in a 100 or 500-year floodplain, which with climate change projections is widely considered to be a 10 or 20-year flood. The takeaway is that with the new FEMA updates, there's only 3 changes, believe it or not, which I was actually really surprised by, because you'd think, oh, all this climate change, what's going on? You're gonna have like so much more land underwater. But actually, it's just 3 private-owned properties that I've circled here. One is at 11 Sugarloaf Street, and then we've got 54 State Road and 64 State Road, which might even be owned by the same people. And essentially, those are the only changes. So in the last 50 years or so, 45 years, this is how much the floodplain maps have changed in Whately. Not a lot. Just sharing that with you because we wanted to know, so we did that process. So these are our final sites for selection, although we are still talking about the common, right? So we've got the town offices. These are all verified, owned by the town. These could work. Hurley Park, the East Whately Cemetery, the old landfill. For those of you that don't know, we'll look at that a little closer. There used to be a landfill, and I think it's on Long Plain Road, and it's no longer used. Whately Elementary, the S. White Dickinson Memorial Library, Whately Center Cemetery, the water treatment plant, where the drinking water comes from for a large part of town, West Whately Cemetery, and the West Whately Triangle, which is basically a traffic island on a slope, which is in the floodplain. So that concludes sort of that first part of the presentation. And now we're going to look at learning about each of the sites, which nature-based solutions could be appropriate for them. And then we'll do a mapping activity, and then you can fill out the survey. So, yes.
It's in front of Paul Newland's house, 148 Conway.
Or does she mean the common? I called it a green meeting. You called it.
Right.
The one that you got, that I'd like to find out.
Oh,
now.
that's not.
So
It's from the old school all the way down to the church.
Okay. So as I said, we're gonna look at examples of nature-based solutions for these 10 sites. Then there'll be a group mapping activity where we've chosen the S. White Dickinson Memorial Library as our template for that process. And then you can vote. So let's start with the town offices. This is like very initial, very broad. This is not a detailed design process, but it's just to kick off the ideas. So what are some of the general site conditions of the town offices? They're mostly full sun. It's not a very vegetated area. Excessively dry soils. The soils are incredibly. That's evidenced by the farm next to it, where you can see the sand visible when it's not under vegetative cover. Yeah, exactly. It's exposed to wind in the sense that it's surrounded by open land and it's dry. High visibility, it could be a good demonstration site. It's, people know about it and they visit it for various reasons. It has very little shade. You can see here there's a picnic bench and there's really not a lot of shade there except during a very specific time of the day. And very low diversity vegetation. It's essentially grass, which is probably non-native fescues and clover. There's a few, I believe, burning bushes, and then there's a couple of coniferous trees planted around it. So that's my sort of initial observations. What are some nature-based solutions that could work here? We could consider a hedgerow. It could be an ornamental hedgerow to provide shade or even provide us a little privacy screen if people want to take a lunch break outside. Windbreaks specifically, which are sort of like taller hedgerows that might have higher canopy trees and shrubs. And a bioswale, or you could also refer to it as a rain garden, where maybe some of the runoff coming off of the parking lot or the building could be captured and native plants could be utilized to absorb that water. So what are some of the benefits of these three nature-based solutions? There would be shading and cooling, especially in the summer, from a hedgerow or a windbreak, which would benefit town staff and people visiting. Wind protection specifically, if it was a windbreak, there would be soil protection because we would be slowing down the wind and potentially doing better job of covering the soil with a more woody and perennial vegetation. We would be slowing runoff with something like a bioswale or a rain garden off the building or off the parking lot or both. All of these solutions would store much more carbon than what is currently on the ground now. And there's a lot of literature to support that. And it would be supporting pollinators and wildlife. And it would provide a sense of privacy, around the building, not being such an exposed area, which could be beneficial for people if they want to have an outdoor meeting or take a lunch break. The old landfill, we don't have an exact address for it, but it's basically opposite across the street from 92 Long Plain Road. And it's an open field that's brushed out maybe once or twice a year. So the site conditions, it's mostly full sun. The soils may be capped. We don't know for sure. We tried to find out. There might be what's called like a membrane under the soil, to keep the old garbage that was dumped there from, leaching. So that could be a consideration in doing a native planting design, is that you would need to know the soil depth before the cap begins. That would determine what kind of vegetation you use. There's high invasive species pressure. There's a lot of knotweed on the forest edges going down on the slope towards the river. And another observation is that it's sort of low visibility. It's not like this widely visited site that people are going to on a daily basis. I think a lot of people don't even. So some nature-based solutions that could work. Meadows. This is from one of our past projects. You could do a riparian buffer between the field area where the landfill was and the stream that's below. That would, be beneficial and for many reasons. And invasive species management, which was not really a nature-based solution per se, but it would be serving that because it would be improving the ecosystems, which is then going to make the site more suited for climate resilience. So some of the benefits: soil protection, absorbing pollutants, specifically off of the landfill. If there was a riparian buffer or even a meadow, that deep-rooted native vegetation would absorb more pollutants than shallow-rooted grasses. Slowing runoff, which would improve water quality in the adjacent river. Support pollinators and wildlife, and protect neighboring properties and people potentially from some of those contaminants that are historical to the site. The S. White Dickinson Memorial Library, I'm sure you're all familiar with it. Site conditions, it's full sun to part shade, so it depends where you are on the site. The front is more shady with the large mature sugar maples. As you get towards the building and beyond, it's sort of all full sun. High visibility, obviously it's one of the major public sites in town. It has low outdoor use in the sense that there's not a lot around the building to sort of garner like doing activities for the kids or for adults. Like you don't really have like a garden or, even a lot of seating areas. I think there might be one bench.
Yeah, but there's concerts are done out there.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
So we would want to make sure that if we do something at that site, we steer clear of that concert area or keep it open space. Or maybe enhance it with some plantings. It's got a low diversity of vegetation. It's essentially sort of like a marginal hayfield with mostly non-native cool season grasses, and there's a little bit of invasive species growing here and there. Like right over here, there was like a bunch of bittersweet in that little mount that I noticed.
Measurements of these approximate sizes, like
Yes.
different.
So the way that this process works is once we pick the sites, the 3 sites, we will do a very, very detailed analysis of each site, including the overall property dimensions, the soil type, the runoff, the slopes, views, sun and shade, all those considerations before we do the designs. I believe that the property actually is if I'm not mistaken, 7 acres that goes all the way back, almost to the sort of hedge of trees that you can see at the base of the hill. It doesn't go all the way to the Mill River, but I was actually on the site with the librarian 3 or 4 months ago, and she didn't even know that the library owned the hayfield.
So, I had no idea.
Yeah, or the field. Let's just call it the field. It's not really a hayfield, it's a field. Yeah. So yeah, it goes pretty far back. I think it goes pretty much to this this line of trees, which is before the ones by the river. That's further down. There's a line of trees right.
Who knew this?
I think it's the Mill River. So, okay, so for the library, here's some nature-based solutions that we might want to consider. We could do a meadow, and this is actually one of our designs for a different library in Eastern Massachusetts, in the town of Wellesley. It could just be a native ornamental garden, or you could have native ornamental garden elements around the building, and then the meadow in the larger field. That's another possibility. You could do both. You could also consider a rain garden or another feature near the building to maybe capture some of that runoff. Some of the benefits would be obviously beauty and diversity, an outdoor educational experience for those visiting the library where they could learn about native plants, learn about butterflies, learn about bees. Maybe we could have more activities in general. Slowing runoff off of the building and off of the driveway with that rain garden feature is a possibility. This would all store much more carbon than the mowed grass that's there right now, which would, all this would also improve water quality because there is the Mill River downslope, and support pollinators and wildlife again. The water, did you have a question?
Yeah, I know, but are there native grasses that can be mowed so you can have some short grass?
Yes, so I have for one of the sites, one of the nature-based solutions is a native lawn alternative. And we've done that several times, and we have like sort of a recipe for that, which includes a lot of sedges, which tend to not need to be mowed because they top off around 8 inches, and shorter flowers like violets and prunella, which is self-heal, and a few others. So yeah, we do have that. And you know, that's part of the activity tonight is, you know, you can suggest that for the library. Like I'm not giving you guys all the answers. I'm just trying to show you a few examples. The water treatment plant is, it's behind 42 Chestnut Plain Road. And it essentially is characterized by these raised mounds, which contain the wells for the town. And then it's on the Mill River. And you can see this is a sign of erosion on the river, where you have a drop in the bank and you can see this exposed soil. That's because these plants used to be up here and they fell. The reason for that is complex because there actually was a pretty big project here where they did restore what they called the meander to the river. And they did a lot of tree planting and even some native mixes. I went out there last fall with the water manager, Wayne. And the problem is that the Mill River is a meandering river. It's never going to stay and keep its course forever. So there is a risk involved in doing any restoration or planting work on this river in that you will lose a certain amount of vegetation and material. That being said, the water supply being right there is an incredibly valuable asset, probably the most valuable asset that the town has. And you know, water's life, and we need to make sure that those wells don't flood and don't get compromised by future flooding events. So the site conditions are full sun to part shade, depends where you are on the site. Moist soils, you know, this is sort of a floodplain environment. High erosion, the river meanders, and it's a high risk flood area. It's right in the 100-year floodplain, which with climate change, we could consider it a 10-year flood. Some nature-based solutions that could work are riparian buffers. This is an example of a riparian buffer design we did for a project in New York State a couple of years ago, where you're seeing different, this is sort of like the base flow of the river and then different flood events and how the riparian buffer functions. You could also consider, this is a bit sort of, you know, have to see how it goes, but maybe a stormwater basin adjacent to the well so that if the river was to flood, it would capture the water before it hits the wells and store it. I don't know if there's enough space for that or what the sort of characteristics of the wells are, how wide they are underground, but I'm just putting it out there as a potential item. Some of the benefits, protecting the water supply from flooding is huge, improving the water quality, not just of the wells, but also of the river itself, bank stabilization and supporting pollination. The West Whately Triangle is at the intersection of Conway and Poplar Hill Roads in West Whately. And some of the site conditions are, it's a full sun to part shade area. It's got, I think, 1 or 2 trees in the island. It's a very steep slope. So to my observations, just doing this initial assessment, this is not our final assessment. I did observe that there's probably a lot of runoff that goes into the road, coming from the higher road into the lower road, and also probably into the adjacent properties. It's a high-risk flood area. This is actually within the 100-year flood. So some nature-based solutions, we could consider bioretention cells, which essentially are more of a engineered rain garden where you have an inflow and an outflow and a deeper area to store water with perennial vegetation. You could also consider a bioswale, which is sort of like a simplified version of a bioretention cell, which might be not having to need so much underground infrastructure, but still receiving the water from the top slope and holding it before it gets to the bottom slope. Some of the benefits, slowing runoff, preventing flooding on the roadways. I should have put roadways and adjacent properties. Stopping contaminants from spreading. You know, roads are dirty. They have contaminants. They have diesel and other, you know, people's AC in the summer is dripping at the bottom of their car and they're driving, it's on the road. You get salt in the winter from the salting of the roads. So to capture that would be great and prevent it from going into the adjacent wetlands. Improving water quality and storing carbon and supporting pollination. And Whately Elementary is a full sun to part shade site, highly visible for obvious reasons. It's got lots of grass. And I think another consideration is that if we were to do a design for this site, it would have to be low maintenance because you've got a small school, probably the staff is already very busy and there are not a lot of people there in the summer. And, you know, native plants tend to be doing a lot of things in the summer. So we want to take that into consideration. To me, it looks like there might be a small little native garden. Let's see. Some nature-based solutions that could work for Whately Elementary would be a native ornamental garden, a container garden where basically you're putting almost like a mini meadow in a raised planter, which is way less maintenance than a formal garden, or a rain garden. Benefits include beauty, diversity, outdoor education for the kids, easy to maintain depending upon what you do, store as water, slowing runoff, storing carbon, and supporting pollination. And Hurley Heath Park, it's actually doesn't have a specific address that I could find, but it's across the street from 267 River Road. I'm sure you all know where it is. It's mostly full sun. There's not a lot of shade around the fields from what I could see, high visibility. It's got a low flood risk. So even though it's adjacent to the river, the Connecticut, it's on this very high floodplain shelf that is historical, and the river has not, to my knowledge, come into the field for anyone's lifetime. So I consider that a low flood risk, and it's also low diversity vegetation, as many turf fields are. Some nature-based solutions that could work are, again, hedgerows. One area that I thought we would maybe consider a hedgerow, this berm along the road. Is it a potential area for that?
The fans are gonna sit.
Yeah, the fans could be, they could be in the shade. I mean,
They sit in their cars.
I've watched my daughter play soccer on a sunny day, and man, do I wish I was in the shade on that. Okay, yeah, so I mean, we haven't done the full analysis. This is just our initial, just some ideas: hedgerow, windbreak, and rain garden. There's a lot of, you know, parking areas. Benefits would include shading, cooling, wind protection, swell protection, slowing runoff, storing carbon, supporting pollinators and wildlife, and maybe some sort of a privacy buffer between the road and the fields. Lastly, we have 3 cemeteries in town, which are town-owned: West Whately Cemetery, East Whately Cemetery, and Whately Center Cemetery. And I grouped them together because they really are very similar in terms of the land use and the site conditions. So the nature-based solutions would be similar that we would have plot. Conditions are full sun to part shade throughout, high visibility, lots of grass, low diversity vegetation. Some nature-based solutions that we consider would be a meadow. A lot of cemeteries nowadays are letting certain areas turn into meadows for various reasons, including maintenance. Or a lawn alternative where you can use flowers instead. You work with some of that. Have it not really. Benefits include beauty, diversity, less mowing, storing water, storing carbon, storing pollinators. So with that, we're going to move into the group activity where we basically, I guess we can gather around these 4 tables. Just go to a table if you're not already at one. We will be handing out markers, pencils, rulers, and some printouts of the library. We've done 2 printouts of the library. One is this, it looks like this, and it is just focusing on the area immediately around the library, between the library and the trees, between the library and the parking lot, and around the sides and the back of the building. The second printout focuses just on the backfield. So you can work with both, or you can just focus on one. But we divided it up into 2. You can maybe pick the map that you prefer to work. And then, so we have 2 copies of each. And then please, before you leave, either scan this QR code with your phone and fill out the survey on your phone, or ask Erica for a paper copy and just fill it out. It will only take about 2 minutes, because that's going to help us decide on the sites.